communication.
Right, and the swiping that apes don't.
Well,
swipe.
that's a very interesting topic too. The like the Tinder phenomenon. That's because that's also a major technological revolution, because what it's done, I would say, for the first time, is reduce the cost of rejection to males to zero, because it hides it. The only people you ever hear from are people who haven't rejected you.
Although but there was one man who had to make 300. He actually tallied it.
Yeah.
He had to make 300 requests of swiping right or whatever
Yeah.
for one reply. So I think he had the sense of rejection.
Sure, but it's massively attenuated.
Yeah.
And it's
because,
not observed.
Yeah, you're not being humiliated.
Not at all.
Right.
Not at all. It's really at arm's length, and you can swipe very, very rapidly, and so you can get all that rejection over with in a very short period of time.
Right. It's like losing a video game or something. You go on to the next.
Less. Because
worse. Not nearly as bad.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know what, and I mean Tinder also reduces the. One of the other things that you want to think about with regards to sex, and I think this is probably particularly true for women, is that to what degree is it in women's interests to allow the cost of sex to fall to zero? Because with pornography certainly does that. And it just seems to me that that's not a very good long-term strategy for relationships between men and women, because whatever sex is worth, the cost of zero is the wrong price. Mm-hmm. And so that's...
you can go to the bunny ranch and pay quite a bit for it.
Well, true, but that's true. But you don't have to. And I've heard from a number of women read blog reports on their frustration with their attempts to be relatively sexually selective. Like, let's say they decide that they're not going to sleep with their new partner on the first date. They're frustrated by the fact that, to the degree that they're being cautious in their sexual behavior, which I think is actually an admirable idea, that they're instantly outcompeted, especially if their partners are somewhat impulsive, by women who will say yes at the drop of a hat. And so, well, again, I don't think, it depends on what the goal is. That's the thing, is that there's short-term sexual gratification, but the literature indicates that married couples, for example, or couples in a permanent long-term monogamous relationship are more sexually satisfied than single people. And maybe the single people have to be parsed out into those who are sexually successful and those who aren't. But I suspect that wouldn't make that much difference. But whatever. There's the utility of relatively immediate sexual gratification, for whatever that's worth, and the adventurousness that goes along with that, let's say, the hunt and the excitement of having a new partner and all of that, and maybe even the danger that's associated with that, because people like to have a little bit of danger in their life. But what's the goal? It's like, what do people want? And I mean, there's a great book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts that was written by Google engineers. And so it contains great psychology, because Google engineers don't care about political correctness, and they just write down what they find, and they don't even notice that it's politically incorrect. Hence James Damore, for example. And what they found was that women use pornography just as much as men, but the pornography that women use is verbal. It's not imagistic. And that the pornographic novels, essentially, follow the same extraordinarily standard plot line, to the degree that publishing houses like Harlequin,
I was going to say it's the bodice rippers, the romance novels.
Yeah, right. So in the Harlequin series, you have the ones that were published like in the 1970s that are they're tame. There's a small bit of,
they're pretty hot, actually.
Well, there's a variety. They range from completely tame to essentially to hardcore pornography. But the plots are quite similar, and the plot is young, relatively innocent woman finds powerful, interesting, dangerous male, tames him, and then they live happily ever after.
Love.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, and it's the Beauty and the Beast plot, which is a fundamental.
Wasn't the biggest search for women on Pornhub we discovered? We did an episode on porn. Was for women it was rape? Wasn't that like the?
No, lesbianism. Or at least that was your porn. Yeah, that was your
That's
search.
not me.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
You know what my porn is? Going to the Williams-Sonoma store.
I know. It is. It is female porn.
All those pots.
Oh, the pots and pans.
No,
but
but
Bill Maher, the philosopher Bill Maher, once said that men and women should never tell one another their fantasies, because women are outraged by what we say and we're totally bored by what they say. And I thought, like, women have kind of these scenarios and, I don't know, unicorns. I don't know what they're doing. Storylines. And men is just like, I don't want to say this to you, but there's a lot of just close-ups of female body parts.
Yeah, well, men are much more visually oriented sexually.
But now they're being shamed. I mean, now it's called the male gaze. And so there's all of this like, oh my God, the Sports Illustrated is exploiting the female figure. I think, yeah, I mean, men like it. And I'm worried that now, sort of the way in the past sexual gays were shamed, we're now reversing it and shaming like heterosexual.
Yes, that's definitely definitely happening.
Remember, we had the young woman who complained about being whistled at, and I said, "Don't worry, it stops."
Yeah.
Do we have a little bit of time for a couple more topics with you? Because one of the things that is coming out of this younger generation, and you have a chapter of it in your book, which I don't.
Sorry, I wanted to finish the line that we were pursuing.
Oh, sorry.
I should do that.
Sorry.
Well, with sexual behavior, the question is, what's the end game? And this is what people have to ask themselves. Is like one of the corollaries to the female pornographic romance is actually the establishment of a long-term relationship. And the question is, it's so funny because I got pilloried in the New York Times for talking about enforced monogamy. It's quite interesting, because
that gets brought up like in every snarky interview.
Ridiculous. It was so ridiculous. I talked to that woman for two days.
I know, and it's just like a little side comment, and then that became like the
Can you
center,
just explain,
the showcase.
like enforced monogamy? You mean forced marriage, or?
No, I mean that it was an anthropological term which she knew perfectly well because she's a very smart person. And all it means is that there's a pronounced proclivity in human societies around the world to enforce monogamous relationships at multiple levels of the sociological hierarchy. You do it culturally, you do it in expectation, you do it legally. And enforced monogamy, so my son was just married, and if he came to me next year and he said, hey, Dad, guess what? I've managed to have 4 affairs in the last year with hot women, and my wife hasn't found out about any of them. I'm not going to pat him on the back and say, good job, kid. I'm going to say, what the hell's up with you? You violated the vow that you took. You're putting your whole future at risk. You're betraying yourself and your wife. And well, that's enforced monogamy. The idea is that the social norm is the establishment of a long-term monogamous relationship, and that there are strictures put in place to support that, but also to punish deviation from it. And you say, well, maybe not so much on the punishment end, but it depends. It's like, what do you want? What is it that you want? You want a long-term stable relationship or not? And if that's the goal, then your behavior should be devoted to whatever it is that facilitates that goal. And I certainly don't see that casual and impulsive sex fits that bill, not in the least. And all of the evidence with regards to living together shows that that's actually detrimental to the establishment of a long-term relationship. So, first of all, common law marriage, people who are in a common law marriage are much more likely to be divorced. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, people who live together before they get married are much more likely to be divorced after they get married. So the idea that, well, you can try someone on for size and see how it works, and then you're going to see if you're compatible. It's like, that's one story. Another story is, well, how about you and I live together for a little while, and, if you're not so bad, but maybe I can find someone better, and if I do, in the next year and a half or so, because we're not hooked together in any formal way, I can just trade you in. It's okay, you can do the same to me. But I don't really see that as the sort of complementary mutual interaction that leads to the formulation of long-term trust. And I think it's a better story for interpreting what constitutes living together than, well, we're going to try each other out because that's what mature people would do.
It's a lease or a rental.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Wash the rental cars, Reagan used to say.
Yeah, well, that's it. But most importantly, the data indicate that it doesn't work. Is that you're more likely to get divorced, not less likely. Because maybe the right attitude is, well, you're probably about as flawed as me, and we're lucky that we found each other, and so let's see if we can make a commitment because we're engaging in something that's very risky, an intimate relationship, and we're going to commit to each other and see if we can build something of value across time. And there's a definite risk in that, but there's a complement to your partner. It's like, well, I think you're worth making a sacrifice for. And what's the sacrifice? Well, it's everyone else. It's a big sacrifice. And if you don't see that as a compliment, then I don't think you're thinking, because not only is it a compliment, it's sort of like the ultimate compliment. And maybe you don't get to have a marriage that works without that complement. Maybe it's so difficult to establish a long-term relationship that's functional that you have to make a walloping sacrifice very early on in the relationship in order for that to even be a possibility. And maybe not, because what the hell do we know about what binds people together? But it's not that easy to stay with someone for a long period of time. It's a real commitment. It takes a tremendous amount of effort. So anyways.
Yeah, but